welcome to episode 10 of Strive, where we talk about security, technology, resilience, and everything IT, all in a virtual environment. I'm Darren Thompson, your host, and today we're going to do something a little different from what I've presented in previous episodes. Since we've now made it to episode 10 and double digits, I thought I would create an extended episode here and try and do something that many of you have reached out and asked me for. And that is to go through the details of a real-life cyber attack so that we can bring to life some of the topics that have been discussed already in the previous 9 episodes of the podcast. So today I'm going to walk you through a recent attack that I investigated personally during my time working in forensics and attack modelling. Company names have been kept anonymous here for obvious reasons, but hopefully this illustration will bring you a little closer to how a breach actually unfolds in the real world. But first, a short disclaimer. Don't forget that the information that I provide here is for general information purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and may be subject to change. For those of you that have not yet looked at episode 3 of this series, which was entitled The Anatomy of a Breach, you may want to go and have a look at that episode. It will give you some useful context and definitely a reference point for some of the terminology that I use to describe this breach. So, let's get into it. Our story sort of begins on a seemingly ordinary evening when the IT organisation's team noticed some unusual activity on their network. It started with a few alerts from an intrusion detection system, an IDS, signalling potential anomalies on the network. At first it seemed like a false alarm, but as the alerts grew more frequent, the IT team realised they were probably facing something a little bit more substantial. Actually, the alerts seen by the IT team were an example of too little, too late in this case. The activity was network traffic stimulated by criminals already communicating with their malware through what is called command and control, sometimes referred to as C2 in security parlance. The attackers had actually started their campaign against this organisation about 3 months previously with a spear phishing attack. A targeted method where malicious actors send deceptive emails to specific individuals within an organisation, and where very often advanced social engineering efforts are employed. In this case, the phishing emails were crafted to appear as legitimate internal communications, complete with familiar corporate branding, familiar language, and even named executive staff members. The phishing emails were apparently from the HR department and contained attachments that referenced incorrect holiday entitlements. Probably enough to make many of us click, and a pretty common ploy in spear phishing campaigns. And that's of course all it took, just for one employee to click on the embedded malicious link, and in this case a remote access Trojan, a rat, was downloaded onto their laptop. In fact, 15 employees in the organisation were targeted with this particular phish. Only 2 of them downloaded the malicious attachment, but of course that was more than enough. The rat enabled the attackers to establish a foothold in the corporate network, and the weaponization phase of the attack was complete. Next, using a tool called Mimikatz, the criminals extracted credentials from system memory, gaining admin access to the corporate network. In fact, what the criminals were able to enable for themselves were some dormant administrative logins that were associated with ex-employees of this organisation. These credentials had been sat in the Active Directory unused for a number of months and were of course not being therefore closely monitored. Perfect credentials for a criminal. With these privileges, the attackers were able to now move laterally across the corporate network, exploiting further vulnerabilities in unpatched systems to gain a further foothold in the network. Then, using standard Microsoft tools, in this case a particular tool called PSExec, they started to remotely execute various commands on various machines and servers across the IT estate in order to further prepare for a ransomware attack. The cyber criminals behind this particular attack were part of a well-known Advanced Persistent Threat APT group, well known for their sophisticated and well-planned operations. Their primary objective in this case was to both encrypt and also exfiltrate sensitive customer information and data and extort the organisation for ransom. Once they had full control and had gathered all the information about the targeted organisation as was needed, which was about 3 months' worth of reconnaissance in this case, the attackers deployed ransomware known as Ryuk, R-Y-U-K, which is notorious for its ability to encrypt entire networks very quickly. Ryuk was particularly effective here because not only did it encrypt files, but it also prioritized the encryption of system backups and disaster recovery copies. So recovery in this case without decryption keys was going to be very difficult and time-consuming. The impact of the attack was immediate and devastating. Critical business applications came to a halt within minutes. The organisation could no longer access critical data, essential systems, customer information, financial records, and internal documents were all encrypted and at the same time exfiltrated from the organisation, rendering them inaccessible. The attackers then left a ransom note demanding a substantial payment of Bitcoin to decrypt the data. In response to all of this, the organisation activated their incident response plan. They started to isolate affected systems to prevent further spread of the Ryuk ransomware, and they engaged cybersecurity experts to conduct a thorough investigation of what was going on. The initial forensic analysis revealed indeed that the attackers had been on the network for several months before the ransomware deployment, and they'd been silently gathering intelligence and preparing very, very well for the ransomware attack. A decision was made by the targeted company here not to pay the ransom, not to pay the criminals, and instead rely on system backups and disaster recovery techniques to get the business back on its feet. The recovery process was complex and time-consuming. The organisation had to rebuild much of their IT infrastructure almost from scratch, almost from the hardware up. And I'll give you an overview now as to the basic steps that were taken by the organisation to recover. Again, the first step was containment. This involved isolating infected systems to prevent the ransomware from spreading any further than it already had. Next came that eradication phase, the business of removing the malicious software and cleaning up the network as much as possible using advanced anti-malware tools. After several days of working on containment and eradication, the restoration process could finally start. This was where things got really tricky. Unfortunately, some critical backups were compromised by the ransomware, and the restoration process here was painstakingly slow. It actually took 8 days to ascertain where the last clean recovery points were for most of the critical business applications. A lot of recent data had been lost, and the business was pretty close to breaking point by the time critical systems could be fully recovered. Once critical systems were back up and running, the process of rigorous monitoring began. Here, implementing enhanced monitoring solutions was necessary to try and detect any signs of residual malicious activity. Was the data really clean now? Had the APT really been rejected from the network? All of this, of course, was reliant throughout on thorough communication with internal and external stakeholders. Priority was given to communicating with those stakeholders across employees, customers, regulators, and various partners. And these communications focused on the breach itself, the steps being taken to mitigate the impacts of it. And unfortunately, the PR fallout here was absolutely awful. I think that this incident underscores really several critical lessons for organizations of all sizes. Firstly, regular cybersecurity training for employees is essential. In this case, better awareness and skepticism to a certain extent towards email and likely phishing attempts potentially could have thwarted that initial breach 3 months before the indicator of compromise. Next, having up-to-date backups stored offline, immutable, that cannot be compromised is completely vital. And of course, the regular testing of those backups would have ensured in this case that they could be relied upon in this emergency. This particular organisation had no concept of something like a clean room, a safe space to restore data that was guaranteed not to have been compromised by the criminal. Regular testing of restoration into a clean room would have saved this organisation a great deal of recovery time. Thirdly, implementing multi-factor authentication would have significantly reduced the risks associated with that credential theft that we saw. Even if the attacker manages to steal a password with something like Mimikatz, MFA would add that extra layer of security needed to prevent unauthorized access. Additionally, employing advanced threat detection techniques, anomaly detection techniques, potentially here could have helped to identify early and mitigate threats in close to real time. These systems can detect unusual patterns of behavior that traditional signature-based detection methods might miss. And in this particular case, the indicator of compromise was, of course, those network alerts that we saw, which were actually caused by command and control traffic from the criminal. The damage by that time, of course, had been done. The organisation's full recovery here took several months, during which they operated at a significant reduced capacity. The financial cost here was immense, not only in terms of recovery expenses, but also in lost business and reputational damage. The slight silver lining here was that the organisation emerged from the crisis with a much stronger cyber resilience posture and a renewed really focus on protecting their digital assets and building a cyber resilience plan. To sum up then, this attack serves as really a stark reminder of ever-present threats that surround all of our businesses and the necessity of vigilance and preparedness. Cyber criminals are constantly evolving their tactics, and we must stay one step ahead to protect our businesses and our data. And often, as we saw here, the basics matter. In this case, good employee awareness and training, good early warning detection systems, as well as good and well-tested backup would have solved a lot of heartache. Before we finish, it should be noted that this particular example and experience of mine dates back from about 2 years ago, prior to my working at Commvault. The customer in question here, the organisation in question, was not using Commvault technology. If they had have been, again, many of their issues may have been resolved through the implementation of some of the technologies that we're working on here at Commvault, not least of which anomaly detection, clean room technology, mutable backups, and so on and so forth. Thanks for joining me on this extended episode of Strive. That's all we have time for today. I hope that you found this useful, and until next time, stay informed, stay secure, and I'll see you in the next one.